So welcome to this watercolor demonstration, slightly different on this demo where I'm not actually talking through what I'm doing. I'm actually going to paint this scene without a drawing. I am drawing with a paintbrush, and I suppose it proves the point how important learning to draw is, because you are always drawing when you're painting. I quite often provide a traceable for members, which I use myself sometimes. It does make the job a little bit easier, but when you're painting, that drawing soon gets lost, so you need to rely on your skills to get yourself back on track. So what I'll do is I'll talk you through a little bit of this painting, and then I'll speed up the last little bit, and I'll answer some frequently asked questions that get asked on YouTube. I've got a list here of questions that people have asked recently, but they get asked again and again, so I shall repeat those. So what I liked about this photo is it was actually a screenshot. Well, it was actually a much bigger photo, and I took a cropped image, much smaller, which meant it a little bit blurry. But one thing that will transform your artwork is when you start thinking about edges, having a good combination of hard and soft edges. Quite often when you work from a photo, the edges will be hard pretty much everywhere, because that's just how a camera works, a good sensor, and it will just pick up all the detail. But what will happen is your photo or your painting will be a bit lifeless, a bit static. So by introducing soft edges, you then start to bring your painting closer to reality, and that's where the realism comes from. This is going to be a very loose painting, because my drawing is probably going to be off in places and so on. The nature of how I'm painting, the washes will run into each other, destroy little parts that I've just drawn and so on, but that's all the beauty of watercolor. And again, this is a bit of an exercise in just letting go of perfection and go for something atmospheric. So this is actually a scene from my local village, Chassignol, and the way I'm drawing this is just looking at shapes, and actually the shape I've just drawn there looked like a pot, a vase, and I was thinking, what's that on the tractor there? And it was only when I actually started to draw the figure I realized that was actually his arm. And that's actually quite a good thing to get into when you're painting and drawing, is really just concentrating on shapes, looking at shapes and relationships of shapes from one shape to another, and how that shape connects to another shape. Does it have a hard edge or a soft edge? Because you kind of take your mind into another way of thinking, that if you start looking at the scene as that's a man's head, that's his shoulder, that's his arm, you kind of tap into those symbols in your head, and you know what a person looks like, and you're more likely to paint the figure of a symbol of a person you see on a sign, which is far from what's there. This image is just made up from shapes. So I'm trying to keep the paper wet. I've started on dry paper, so we'll answer some questions before we speed this up, and I'll stick a bit of music on or something afterwards, but I'll keep the music off while we're talking. That I think you prefer no music. So one of the questions always gets asked is, do I start on dry paper? Most of the time, well, 99.9% of the time, I'm on dry paper. The paper's dry where I'm working now, but obviously the areas where I've painted are now damp. So the whole, if I'm doing a landscape, I very quickly wash that sky in. The paper's now damp. So I wouldn't get fixated in, whether the paper needs to be dry or damp at the start. Ask yourself, why does the paper need to be damp, or why does it need to be dry? And the simple answer is, what kind of edge do you need? If you need a hard edge, the paper has to be dry. Or, again, this is what makes watercolor tricky. It could be just damp, but you then need really strong, thick paint to get a harder edge. But it probably will be a soft edge. That if you want that true, crisp, sharp edge, the paper has to be dry. And if you want it soft, an exploded edge, the paper has to be really wet. So that's the question you should be asking. There are some artists who completely wet the paper back and front and paint that way. You can get some very spontaneous wet into wet techniques that way, but no control. So I tend not to use that because I'm focused on trying to teach people to paint watercolor. So it would be very difficult to control that. So certainly for a beginner, I really would not wet the paper to start the demo, because it's going to be a nightmare to try and follow, because until you understand the paint to water ratio, it's just going to become a mess. I'm sure we've all been there. So that's that question. So another question, a bit more slightly not the normal question I get asked, is do I match the photos when I'm painting? It depends on the photo. If it's a super duper photo that everything is perfect, quite possibly, but that very rarely happens. There's always something in a photo you need to change. For instance, this photo here, I'm going to remove the tractor behind the main tractor. That I don't think it needs it, so I shall take that out. I'll probably throw a shadow across the building at the back. Again, just adds more light and interest, but the rest of it's pretty good. So on that occasion I'll stay fairly close to the photo. And again, for teaching methods, I use a lot of mid-journey images, and the reason for that is because all the decisions have been made on that there's no complications, everything's worked out, so it's going to be easier for people to follow. Certainly painting from photos is much trickier. Perla versus Rosemary & Co brushes that I use quite often. These brushes here, this is a Skoda Perla and a Rosemary & Co Sable Blend. I tend to have quite a few of these Perlas in stock. They do lose their point over time and they go a little bit furry like that. That's a new one, it's got a good point. So I tend to use the Skoda Perla when I want a bit of control and more detail and a point, which I'm using at the moment. If you want to make your brushes last a little bit longer, use an old brush for mixing paint and scrubbing, and then just use the new one for actual painting. I used to do that, whether I still do now unconsciously, but that will make your brushes last longer. I just like the way the Rosemary & Co Sable Blend holds the paint. It holds a lot of paint. It's got a fairly good point on it, which this is quite an old brush and it still has a good point, so it perhaps lasts a little bit longer. And both are fairly inexpensive brushes. What palette do I use? Just a normal cheap palette that you can buy from any art store. The important thing is it's got a lid on it to keep the paints fresh. That someone asked a question recently, do I put out fresh paint every time I paint? That my paints seem to be very moist. You can see at the start of this demo I squeezed out a little bit of fresh paint, but I'm not cleaning the palette out or anything like that. That I just put fresh paint on top of paint that's starting to sort of go off. But it's particularly on a scene like this where I want those strong darks. That's the only way I can get those darks is by having fresh paint. So that's why I use fresh paint. And I use Daniel Smith and Rembrandt paints. I find they wet up quite nicely and they stay wet for a long time. I often give my paints a little spray with my little mister, and sometimes put a wet tissue in the palette if I'm going to store it for a long period of time. Color temperatures, someone asked about, could you choose warm or cool? I tend to try and have both in the painting. It makes it a little bit more dynamic, again closer to life. That in this scene here we've definitely got those cool blues in the smoke, we've got that warmth on the building and on the road. So we get that play of warm and cool colors that maybe you can have a more dominant one that certainly values. So we're speeding up the demo a bit here. I've still got a few questions to answer. So if you sort of squint at the scene, I've got more dark shapes than light shapes. I think I tend to try and go sort of heavy in the value, either light or dark. Certainly I wouldn't split it half and half. It makes the painting trickier to follow. And you can see here there that the wheel is now melting into the background. So this is a fairly different way of painting watercolor, very sort of loose, spontaneous. I wouldn't do a demo for you to follow along in this way because it's quite likely to end in a disaster. But the thing to do is don't panic. When mistakes happen, just keep going and you know, watercolor as a medium, it's very difficult to fix mistakes and so on, but that's, you know, not completely true. You can lift paint off, you know, you can re-wet areas, you know, use the hairdryer to speed things up. But that all comes down to experience. But what I'm not doing is scrubbing at the paper with tissue. I'm not using a brush to, you know, really scrub and try and fix things. That I am sort of going at it methodically and with a sort of with experience. What paper size is a good paper for beginners? Keep it small. You know, I tend to paint 9 by 12 inch on the demos, because the reference picture is normally A4, so they're very similar in size. I used to paint a lot of 7.5 inches by 11 inch, which is, you know, the full sheets folded again, folded again. So you can get maximum out of the full sheets. You'll struggle if you're a beginner painting large scenes, just because things will dry quicker, or you've got to move around the paper quicker. So keeping it small is a good idea. So what else we got? I think we're nearly there for those questions. So yeah, the last one is it get to a point where you do too many tutorials? Never. Obviously, I want you to watch the video and hit that like and subscribe, etc., and all of that. But today I was watching some watercolor tutorials by French artists to listen to the French, to try and learn a bit of French. But I never get bored of watching people paint. It inspires me. If you're ever kind of, you know, not knowing what to paint or what should I do or can't be bothered or whatever, you know, if you're watching a demonstration, you know, you are learning, you're taking stuff in. So I don't think I'd ever get bored of you know, putting YouTube on and watching some people paint, etc. So hopefully you enjoyed that video, and I've answered a few questions there. Fire away and ask me more questions, and I can answer them. More than happy to do that, and you know, quite like to do them on a video like this if there's questions that get asked again and again. So what I'll do is I take the tape off once this is finished. You know, I'm just fiddling now, really, that you know, when you're looking for things to do, that's the time to stop. That it's very easy to overwork it, you know, potentially, you know, I've got away with it on this one, but you know, it's such a fine line. So take that tape off and pop it in a nice frame, and it becomes, you know, a finished piece. And I think it's important to you know, mount it, frame it to see it as a final piece. And you don't actually have to physically do that. I sometimes use Gemini or ChatGPT AI apps and just upload my photo and ask it to put it in a mount and a frame and show me a picture. So that's what I did on this occasion, and I advise you to perhaps give that a go if you want to see your painting as a finished piece. So there we go. Until next time, hit the like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.